And I am thrilled to be joined by two of my good friends. So first, I want to introduce Chris Souza. Chris has been active on our page for a long, long time. Love having him on the page. Welcome, Chris. How you doing, bud?
Doing good. How about yourself?
Doing well, doing well. And then Kyle Walton. Kyle, this is the second time on the show, I believe. Kyle's been an old friend of mine, so represent
Oh yeah,
that libertarian type of view. Welcome, Kyle.
thanks, man. Glad to be here.
So the first question is always going to be, what are you drinking tonight? So I'll start with you, Chris. What you got?
I'm just having a Modelo with lime and salt. Usually I prefer IPAs, but sometimes I get a little sick of them and need something a little bit lighter. So it's been nice.
Yeah, I remember last time you had something that you were allergic to, and you were just powering your way through it. Is that the same stuff?
I think so. Yeah, I think I'm allergic to hops, but I'm not quite sure because
Power
on
through.
my second IPA I usually start sneezing. So
Yeah. How about you, Kyle?
Yeah, drinking. This is called Queen Charlotte's Rum. It's from a local distillery here in right outside Charlotte, a place called Belmont, Muddy River Distillery. I actually got two custom stills in the place, and they're called Liberty and Democracy.
There you go.
So those are
Oh,
the names of the stills. Queen Charlotte's Rum, pretty good.
dude, I love that. And then what I've got is a local brewery in Pensacola. There's a lighthouse down the street about maybe half an hour from where I live, and they've got a brewery right next to it where they put out one of my favorite beers. So love to get that. And yeah,
Nice.
Florida's not necessarily known for its beer, but they're not bad at it either. So I enjoy it. And given that it's like Wednesday, right, I don't want to go too hard, too heavy. So that's where I'm at tonight. So now, kind of talking about like why we do this. We do a series on Sundays called Conservatism on Tap, hence the drinking. But it's where we get to talk about our conservative perspective as it relates back to Edmund Burke, and we get to kind of like my brother and I talk through it. How do we apply our belief system to the world today? But just as important as that is the chance to interact with people who believe different things and to have that discourse. Burke was very big on constantly learning from other people that were different, constantly engaging with them, and then really nurturing that debate because he saw that as how society moved forward. And that's what I get to experience with you guys, and I love doing it. Is we get to hear from your perspective, Christopher, as someone who comes more from the liberal democratic side, and then Kyle for you more the libertarian side, and then I kind of represent the Burkean perspective. But given that fact, I love that we get to exchange. We may not always agree, probably don't agree on a whole lot, frankly, when it comes to politics, but we can at least engage with each other. And then that kind of proves that it's certainly possible as opposed to so much of the vitriolic hate that you see out there on social media today. And so tell me, like, what do you guys see as the value in this? And what do you get from it exactly, Christopher, that makes it special?
I mean, so much of everyone who engages politically
Yeah.
online is spent, dealing with just insults and infighting and dragging people online.
Yeah.
So this is a nice break from that. It's a time when I can relate to people who may not have the same ideology, but who are super cool people who I get along with and who are kind and open-minded.
Yeah.
And there's just not enough of that today. And hopefully we can be an example
Yeah.
to others we know and others who maybe encounter the page
Yeah.
who maybe don't have that and also need that little bit of a refresher.
Yeah. Well, I also think it brings us from behind the keyboard and we actually get to talk to each other, to see each other. And there's something to be said for that is we kind of, there's the idea piece of this, but then there's also the relational aspect of this. And it's kind of, it's easier to dismiss somebody when they're just a name on a keyboard. But then, actually having this interaction, I can bring those questions or those comments that people have to you and see how you relate to that on the spot. How about you, Kyle?
Yeah, absolutely. I echo everything Chris was saying. I've had a lot of conversations with people over the last couple of weeks, especially as it seems like our nation is kind of devolving into chaos and just filled with discord and vitriol, like you said. And I've had conversations with people and have really just urged people, look, we have a lot more in common than we have in disagreement, and that's something I said on our last show together.
Yeah.
And it's really what I've been encouraging people to do is to find, reach out to neighbors who are different than you and realize that you have a lot more in common than you think.
Yeah.
I've been really actually pretty discouraged over the last couple of weeks trying to encourage people to have conversations, and people on both the right and the left are telling me you can't even have a conversation. Like it's not even possible anymore.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's true because it's what we're doing right now.
I was watching a video this morning, and it was Black Lives Matter members who actually uh, came to a Trump rally and started interacting with people. And there was definitely a lot of shouting at first and some threats made and stuff like that. But then at one point on the Trump rally, they actually allowed them to come up there and gave them 2 minutes to speak. And he got to talk about how, hey, you conservatives, you're skeptical of government. It's like, that's how we feel about the police is we're not against
Sure.
every cop. We're not anti-cop. We're simply against bad cops. And all of a sudden, there were Trump supporters who were like, yeah, we kind of are too. Like, we're not going to stand up for someone who's going against
Of
our
course.
training and regulations and stuff like that. And as they went back and forth, they started to find some common ground. And then they interviewed the Black Lives Matter leader, and he was taking pictures with a Trump supporter and the guy's kid at the end of it. And so,
Yeah.
I think there's a model for that. It might just not fit the narrative that you get from the media. Is what I like, Chris. What I experience so much is it seems like there are folks that are invested in keeping both sides hating each other. Do you see that, and where do you think it comes from? If so,
Certainly, and it comes from this idea of a culture war, this idea of identity politics,
yeah,
the idea that anyone who doesn't vote the same way that you do is the enemy, and it's very toxic. But it's something that is also very psychologically rewarding and appealing to a lot of people. It's something that you get those likes and retweets and endorphins from.
yeah,
So it's definitely uh, a nasty human impulse that is very difficult to fight.
yeah. One of the things that you said last time that I really appreciated is you talked about how people see diversity within their own movement, but then they're quick to assume that everybody that is part of a different ideology or political party doesn't have that diversity, and you do. You talked about, the people that you support and don't support for the Democratic nomination when that was happening, and where you're at now. So, seeing that type of diversity is what really gives me hope because I can look at, some liberals and I can say, hey, these guys are channeling maybe they're Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Paine or previous Americans that have come through. And then you look at some people that are much further left and, hey, wait a minute, that's not a belief system that's necessarily American at all. But you could also do that on the right, couldn't you, Kyle? You could look at some conservatives
Absolutely.
and say, hey, they're actually trying to, pursue a restoration of American ideals or defend them or whatnot. And then I've seen people that go way further than that to the point that I'm not sure they're talking about the America, right?
Sure.
Yeah, the America
Yeah.
we grew up in, or even the founding at all. So,
Yeah. No, I think that's true, and I think what we've got to do is really have more conversations. We got to encourage people to turn off the news because I think you guys have both hit the head hit the nail on the head here. Is that it seems like our media is trying to be pretty divisive, and not just our media. We go on social media. We talked about this last week. We do things for likes and for sound bites and for laughs and things like that. And if we can put down the news, if we can put down our phones and social media and actually have conversations, build relationships and communities, things like that, I think that's how we come back.
So I want to get to some specifics here and also answer some of the questions because I asked today, hey, if we're having Kyle and Chris back on the show, what would our followers want them to talk about? And going through some of those questions, one of them was, how long will CHOP survive? How long will the autonomous region that's being set up in Seattle survive? So my question before we get into that, how long it'll survive for you, Chris, is first of all, how do you see the protests and the riots now? Do you support them fully, and where do you draw the line? And then we'll get to that autonomous region. But answer that for me first. I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, overall, I'm very supportive of the protests. As far as CHOP, I think that it will not last very long. I also think some of the fear mongering about it has been a little out of control.
Yeah.
I mean, Occupy Wall Street wasn't that long ago, even though we've all kind of moved on and forgotten about it, as well as the Tea Party. But this idea of, a space just being kind of occupied isn't necessarily a new protest tactic.
Yeah.
It's not something that typically lasts very long. I don't expect the nation of Chaz to be recognized by the United Nations anytime soon. But other than that, I support nonviolent protest. I am a little concerned with its relationship to COVID. I'm concerned about another outbreak. However, the root causes of the protest are highly necessary right now, as the police response, I think, has shown. These are protests over police brutality, and the response to them has been overwhelming police brutality. So, yes, I absolutely condemn the rioting, looting, arson, violence on the side of protesters. I also think it's worth pointing out that a lot of the violence in these protests has been committed by the police themselves.
Well, so let me ask you this: do you support the defund the police movement, and to what extent?
I don't necessarily support defunding the police, which, I think means so many different things. It's one of those slogans that
Yep.
means 80 different things depending on who you ask, which in my mind makes it not a fantastic slogan. Um, but I do support moving the money around to better ways of training police, taking the military aspect out of our police. They don't really need to have funding go toward tanks
Yeah.
in American streets, in my opinion. But I would use that funding to train police better. And I would also propose a lot of necessary reforms to the police, such as ending qualified immunity, banning chokeholds, and many others
Yeah.
to get them to be more accountable.
Yeah. See, I mean, right there, I think we can find some common ground pretty easily because as a conservative, my first thought when I'm thinking of government is making sure that it's focused, that its purposes are clear, and that its functions are defined. And then to those ends, that's where, we can fund it appropriately and fix any problems. But I understand that when you're looking at government, the incentives can be difficult. And so if someone says, hey, we want to help the police get better, we want to reform them, like absolutely, I can meet you there. But whenever, and the same thing with like the Black Lives Matter, when he gets up there at a Trump rally and he says, I support cops, I just don't support it when they ignore the rules. I'm like, I totally agree. But when someone says defund the police, it's kind of this, again, bombastic type phrasing that makes me think that you want to get rid of them entirely. And now we have a completely different conversation. And that's what I see with this autonomous region. And it starts, in my mind, to give liberals a bad name because now it seems like you're standing up for something that very few liberals actually are. So how about you, Kyle? As more of the libertarian, liberty-minded
Sure.
conservative, as you would call it, where do you stand on that whole issue?
So I guess it really depends on which issue. I'm definitely for the protests. As a libertarian or libertarian-leaning conservative, I can see a lot of danger in militarized police.
Yeah.
And so not just in terms of equipment and gear and vehicles, but in terms of tactics, like no-knock raids, like libertarians and especially gun rights people like myself. This has been used in red flag warrants, no-knock warrants. For a long time, and it's gotten a lot of people killed. Like you go busting up on someone's door at 3 o'clock in the morning, don't announce who you are.
Yeah.
That's a dangerous situation you're putting yourself and everybody else in. That's what happened with the Breonna Taylor situation.
Right.
So as far as defunding the police, I definitely think there's reforms that need to happen, and so I can get on board with some of that. Obviously, we have to have law and order, and so there's got to be a middle ground there, somewhere for us. As far as Black Lives Matters go, definitely for the protests. I do think that is a troublesome organization, although I do like the statement and the sentiment. Obviously, every Black life is important. Every Black life has value. But the organization is not something that I want to support, and I don't think most conservatives should support it, honestly, based on a lot of things they purport and value.
We broke it down on one of our previous live sessions, and we looked at, what does Black Lives Matter actually on their website actually stand for?
Right.
And there are parts of it that it's like, absolutely, if you want to talk about,
Sure.
Do we value the lives of Black people in our society? Absolutely. Do we want
Sure.
healthy to have access to equal rights and opportunities? Absolutely. Do we want to go back to the racism, of segregation or, God forbid, slavery? Of course not.
Of course not.
Easy part.
Yeah, of course not.
But then there are other parts of it that get added in
Right.
that are completely, seemingly to me separate to it. And then you're talking about a wholesale leftist agenda, and that's what.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It just comes back to what do we mean by that? And I think I think, Chris, that's
Yeah,
where it helps with this show is to like tell me what you mean. If you say reform the police, okay, I can get with you. But if you say defund the police, I'm going to be against a liberal who says that really anyone, because as a Burkean conservative, I believe that human nature is a mix of good and evil, and we need it. I mean, dude, I've gotten pulled over in my life probably half a dozen times, and I'm pretty sure I deserved it every single time. And I was like, yep, I wasn't paying attention, and thank God that a cop pulled me over because it reminded me to obey the speed limit. It reminded me that like even if I'm tired, I need to wake up. Otherwise, I'm going to hurt somebody. I'm going to hit someone. So there is this piece of it. The same thing as there's all these conservative memes that come out talking about how if you're experiencing you're a victim of a criminal act, who are you going to call? A social worker for that?
sure.
You need that police function. So how do we navigate that, Christopher? What can conservatives do in their interactions with liberals that bring out like what you're talking about, more of the reasonableness as opposed to us constantly fighting?
I mean, I think you have to start by accepting the premise of many conservatives that the government does too much and that the government often steps on individual rights. And when you engage along those lines, and agree with the "don't tread on me" style ideology, start from there.
Yeah,
Bring up incidences where the police have overstepped on targets that might be a little bit more sympathetic
yeah,
to conservatives. Those are all strategies, I think, to really kind of bridge this divide,
okay,
because both the left and the right absolutely agree
yeah,
that the government does too much and the government should step out of certain things, and that armed agents of the government sometimes violate people's rights.
yeah.
So I think once we kind of agree on that basic principle, the rest is all specifics.
Yeah, I mean, it's been amazing watching conservative, leaders. You've got like Candace Owen and Charlie Kirk and Glenn Beck all of a sudden have discovered a passion for government activity in the form of cops, right? We feel the
Right.
same way about, the military is, hey, we're going to argue that, the incidents of police brutality are few and far between and don't actually describe the whole. But we don't do that with many other government institutions because we don't agree with their fundamental purpose. But getting more to your point, we had a question here that was talking about postmodernist theory. This was from Jacob, and he said, in the current year where postmodernist theory has saturated itself into our daily lives, how does this push moderates to one side or the other? And I want to break that down for a minute. When we talk about postmodernism or postmodernist theory, how I see that is kind of the breaking down of what you called those basic assumptions, Chris, of does, are we approaching our country and its politics with the same way? So if you were, Kyle, this is for you, Kyle, first, but if you were to look at American politics, what would you say are some of those core assumptions that we should all have, like both liberal, conservative, libertarian, whatever? What would you say are some of those? Obviously, not all, but what comes to your mind
Sure.
when you think of a common baseline for?
Uh, sure. So, I mean, I think a love of country is one, just a base love of country. I think respect for the office of the president, whether you agree or disagree. And there's certainly things to disagree and agree with every president.
Yeah,
But I think we have a base level of respect for the office, but also an understanding that, those are servant leaders. They're not our rulers. They're not our overlords.
yeah,
And so something to kind of keep that in check. But yeah, so general patriotism, respect for the office. I think just general respect and love for your neighbor is a really big one.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
So let me ask you, Chris. Then, do you love your country?
Of course.
But I don't think that conservatives believe that about liberals. Maybe we don't hear it enough. Is we hear all of these critiques of our country. Get the police out of here, or America's systemically racist. We've got a president that we hate. Hear all of these critiques, and you think about it like in a relationship. If you were in a relationship with someone who constantly criticized you all day long, you would pretty quickly get the feeling that they hate you, right? That would not be fun for you. My wife and I do this thing where, whenever we are looking at each other's artwork, is you have to say something nice first because it is immediately hurtful. You just say, "Hey, I saw your video, with John and lighting," and I'm like, "I know, but can you at least acknowledge that I tried really hard to make it good?" So I'm kind of throwing it back at you, Chris. I totally agree with Kyle. Is that when I interact with people who are liberals, the first thing that they do is they go to that criticism of America, and I tend to agree with the criticism, but like, for the love of God, can you say something nice about America first? Right? So, do you agree with that? Do you think that liberals have a problem with
I,
that? And if not, why not?
Yeah, no, constructive criticism has always been something that the left has struggled with. Not
Say that.
struggling to make those valid critiques without coming off as overly judgmental, overly cynical. Because I'm not a cynical person. I'm a deeply optimistic and idealistic person,
Yeah,
and I'm someone who I feel like I'm very patriotic.
yeah,
However, that doesn't always come across, as you say, when you start with the negative. I mean, we do have a tendency to look around at other countries that we feel are more enlightened
yeah,
in some way, or at least just a better organized society with better social services. However, there's a lot to be said for the American spirit of equality, freedom, skepticism of government control,
yeah.
that I think are all great things when properly applied.
Right. So, like, be clear about it. Give you a clear example. I personally, so speaking for myself, if you wanted to take the Confederate statues and put them in a museum, I would be okay with it. You know why? They lost the war, right? Like, oh for 1. And they stood for the wrong things. Like, I get that they stood for states' rights, but it was states' rights that were intertwined with slavery, right? We don't need to ignore our past or forget it, but we don't have to display it so prominently. But don't come after Abraham Lincoln. Don't come after Thomas Jefferson, right? Who himself was a liberal. It's that point, Chris, is we can agree on, hey, people who broke away from America and stood for the wrong things, got it. Like, we don't need to be celebrating that. But there's a fear amongst conservatives that you're going to take away the good people as well, the baby out with the bathwater, and that's where people get nervous, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, Kyle. Do you see it the same way or differently?
No, absolutely. And I mean, we can just look at what's going on right now as evidence. I mean, there was a statue of Matthias Baldwin in Philadelphia, who was an early abolitionist. He was Black Lives Matters before Black Lives Matters existed. And just in everyone's hatred of everything that is American history, it seems like that statue was, defaced. I see a lot of parallels here between what's going on now and the French Revolution, where you just want to burn everything to the ground. The famous thing is the goal of the French Revolution was to strangle the last monarch with the guts of the last priest,
Yeah.
and it was just an attempt to undermine and get rid of every institution that held France together. And while, of course, there are reforms that need to happen, the reason the American Revolution was so successful compared to the French Revolution is that we had institutions that we cling to and that we exalted here in America.
Right. I mean, if you want to take every Confederate statue, take a statue of Robert E. Lee, replace it with a statue of Robert E. Lee surrendering to Ulysses S. Grant. Like, we're good. Like, we're good. But conservatives get this nervousness when you want to eradicate all of history, which is, you're exactly right, Kyle, is what was happening with the French Revolution. And Burke stood against that. He recognized that. He's like, this is not the same thing as the good things that are happening in America. So we could beat that dead horse all day, but I really wanted to articulate that, Chris, because I think that's helpful for you to say that, to say, hey, as a liberal, I do love my country, before you get into the process of critiquing it. But let me ask you, what are some things, Chris, that maybe are wrong assumptions that liberals have about conservatives that we could clarify or do a better job of articulating to you?
I mean, a common assumption is lack of empathy, which obviously
Yeah,
is not true in either of your cases. Um, Another assumption, well, I guess I don't know how you would necessarily,
dude.
individually or personally, would
Yeah,
solve that. It has to be kind of solved on a more of a political level, on the level of our elected officials,
yeah,
actually kind of putting their money where their mouth is and
yeah,
making an effort to help not only their constituents but the country at large,
Yeah.
which is a struggle not just for those on the right but those on the left as well. Um,
Yeah.
Another stereotype or assumption would be, science denial,
Yeah.
distrust of expertise,
Yeah.
and I don't know. I just feel like
I'm writing them down. Keep
you
going.
guys have a lot of work ahead of you as far as destroying those assumptions in the Republican Party. And, I had a lot of hope in 2016 that those assumptions would kind of be destroyed,
Yeah.
and that Donald Trump would be defeated
Yeah.
and not ascend to even the top of the primary.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too,
But
Chris.
unfortunately, there was a very loud, outspoken base that was a minority, who decided to go the other direction on that. After 2012, there was this huge autopsy of the Republican Party led by Bobby Jindal,
Yeah.
saying, we can't be a party that embraces racism. We can't be a party that embraces sexism. We can't be a party that embraces science denial. We have to kind of appeal to the youth of America. And then in 2016, I don't think people really listened to that.
Well, so let me respond to some of that. So you talk about empathy, and I, or the lack thereof, and I totally agree with it, man. Because it made me think of this decision that just came down from the Supreme Court, and you have Kavanaugh on it, who is responding to the decision, and he actually dissents against it. But it's not because he hates gay people or transgender people, and he says that he's like, I actually want this to happen. I want transgender and gay people to be protected. There's just a right way and a wrong way to do it. And he says the right way is for Congress to do this, and they've been trying for years. And so the Senate needs to ratify the House's bill, and the president needs to sign this into law. And I love the fact that he does that, because the assumption first is, oh, he's voting against, gay and transgender people because he distrusts them or he hates them. And maybe there are people who feel that way in the conservative movement. But speaking for myself, that's not at all how I feel. I have people that are gay that are in my life, family members, friends, and I don't hate them. I don't want them to be denied happiness or rights or the chance to live the American dream, right? What we get nervous on, Chris, is the idea that our religious liberty is going to be infringed to the point that you're going to have some church that is not allowed to believe differently. And now they're forced to hire people that don't line up with their more traditional Christian beliefs. And so if we could get to this point where, in secular society, people have a right to do what they please, but then religious institutions are protected as well, I think the vast majority of conservatives are going to agree. But you're totally right on the empathy piece, that we don't always express that. And maybe sometimes we don't even get credit when we do. So what do you think, Kyle? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I do. I'm with you. I think Kavanaugh's position is right there. That obviously, I don't know any conservative who hates gay people. I just don't. I know that's a stereotype that all Christian Republicans hate gay people, but it's not true. I have gay friends in my life. I have family members. I got trans people in my life. I got nothing but love and happiness. I hope for the best for sure. Yeah. But the issue again is we have a system of jurisprudence in this country where laws are passed a certain way.
Yeah.
And when courts interpret those things in different ways, it sets up a lot of issues. And we see the same thing happen in the gun rights community. The ATF will come out with an interpretation on something that changes how a law is written or interpreted.
Yeah.
And then it happened just recently. Trump told them to do the opposite. So ATF went through and automatically made thousands and thousands of guns automatically illegal just based on an interpretation of something. That was not even Congress or a judge doing that. That was a bureaucracy. That was a law enforcement agency.
That's just a lesson for us, is to start off with that every time. Is before you take some stand that's going to be misinterpreted, you say, hey, you look at someone who's different than you and say, hey, I love you as a person, and I want you to have the rights to make choices in your life. Then you move to the point of, I also want to defend my rights to believe differently.
That's right.
My church is telling me, something different. I want to be able to follow that, even if you disagree with it. We don't always do a good job of it. The second piece of it.
If I could.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I just want to touch back on that, I think, and not to be too defensive, but I look back at Mitt Romney's, presidential run in 2012, and the same things that were said about Trump, about how he was racist, he is homophobic, he is misogynistic. All those things that were said about Trump were also said about Romney. And
True.
now that Romney is kind of like the poster child of the tolerant Republicans or whatever, I'd say most Democrats have really embraced Mitt Romney these days. But 8 years ago, they were saying he was a racist and a liar and a homophobe and all those different things.
Yeah, and
So, I mean, I think we've got to come to some sort of good faith discussion where we've got to stop the name calling. If we want to believe those things are true, that's fine, but, be consistent.
the same thing with Bush, right? As he's putting Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell in positions of power. He's traveling all over the world. He's doing humanitarian work all over the world now, and he was still, he was ambassador for that by some. But not by all. Again, not by all, just by some.
Not by everyone.
But I want to respond to Chris's other critique, which it gets into the science of things, and this kind of, I think, it really deals squarely with that postmodernism that Jacob was asking about. Is we get to a point where the things that line up with our worldview are facts, and the things that don't is fake news. I don't. This is a question for both of you guys. Is how do we break out of that? Because I can find studies that tell you right now that Obama is the most loved president of our lifetimes, and I can find a study that tells you that he's the most hated. You can go back and look at polling that says that Hillary Clinton was going to win by 5 points, and then you can find polling that said, oh, I saw Trump coming a mile away. Chris, so when you talk about science and stuff, and you talk about expertise and all of that, I mean, we could go through COVID, we could go through so many different things. Where is the line between, objectivity and critical thinking and simply going along with a narrative without actually, challenging its assumptions? How do we get there, Chris?
It can be tough. I think it just starts with trying to learn the difference between a reliable and an unreliable source.
Yeah.
If you look at coverage in the New York Times, the Washington Post, they get things wrong occasionally, maybe more than occasionally, but more often than not, they issue retractions, they issue apologies. And then if you look at the alternative sources, whether they're on the left or the right, they don't have that record of retracting things when they get it wrong, of apologizing, of taking things down. And so, we kind of have to grade on a curve. There is no perfect news source. Yeah. There's no such thing as pure objectivity. But I do think there is still quite a big difference between the news organizations that get lambasted in the mainstream media and the alternatives that people are seeking.
Yeah.
If you ask a lot of Trump supporters where they get their news from, it's One American News Network, or it's Sean Hannity, or it's Town Hall, or, and these places are not superior to mainstream outlets. They may sometimes uncover stories that mainstream outlets don't because their biases are different.
Yeah.
But their biases may be different. That doesn't make them any less strong. In fact, in many ways, their bias is a lot stronger than your average centrist Democrat New York Times reporter. Yeah. So, it comes with acknowledging bias. It comes with acknowledging that there is no pure objectivity. But I do think it's a little funny that this whole idea of postmodernism is something that traditionally was associated with the left. And now you see it kind of making a comeback in a big way on the right. I mean, I had a conversation with a guy in your comment section the other day who literally said, I don't care if Trump lies about people. I don't care if he, calls politicians' wives ugly because those politicians disagree with him. It makes liberals mad, so I like it. And that is the definition of postmodernism, the complete denial that truth matters, the complete denial that morality matters. Sure, this exists on the left as well. Perhaps it used to exist on the left in greater numbers than the right, but I think it's something that has become more of a right-wing phenomenon.
What do you think, Kyle? You agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think, with postmodernism being about the subjection of truth, like, we see it all the time. Speak your truth, instead of the truth, because truth does matter, Yeah. No, I think we definitely see it on both the right and the left. I think that people again, just seek out the news sources that they want to confirm their own biases. They don't generally give the other side any time of day or any kind of credible thought. And yeah,
There's
that's
a great question.
pretty much all I got to say on that. I don't have anything crazy
All
to
right.
say. Yeah.
There's a great question that
Yes.
just came in. And from one of our followers, they asked, which side do you think tries to force the other side to think the same way? And you guys tell me if I'm wrong, but I would say both. I would say there is this belief in both sides today that if I can argue someone into a new way of thinking, if I just humiliate you in public, then, maybe a bunch of your followers will come to my side, right? Or maybe there's this like spitefulness and vengefulness that says that you kind of were talking about, Chris, that just says, hey, if I can just smear you down, it's going to make me feel better. And that's good. That's affirming to my belief system. But it's the same thing, I would say in these riot movements, whenever they get to the point of extreme violence, is they've gone to a point where they don't care about reforming the police system. They just want to burn the whole thing down. So I do think it exists on both sides. The question is, how do we get out of it? And I think it's by having conversations like this. The other piece that I would also add too, and this speaks to the media, but it could easily be other sources as well, is it seems like there's no room for evolution in terms of your belief. Like, guys, I believe something totally different than I did when I was 20 and when I was
Sure.
12, right? If you could quote me from when I was 16 and it would probably be horrific, But that's
Oh yeah.
human growth is, challenging your assumptions and growing. And I think Bert believed that. And what I say is what I see Burke actually providing to the debate that doesn't exist now is kind of a critique of ideology. So to me, that is the essence of Burkean conservatism, is a pushback against ideology, with that being defined as a set belief system that can't really sustain a challenge and just involves a warpath, right? So you're a conservative. That's great. Be a better conservative. Learn
Yeah.
more about your belief system. Learn more about what it means to be a conservative. Recognize whatever weaknesses exist in that worldview, and then learn from other people how to defend that better. The same thing for a liberal or progressive, Chris, is great. That's what you believe. How can you get better? And I see that again, kind of bringing it back to that whole Black Lives Matter and Trump rally. I see them actually learning in that environment how to relate to one another. As the Black Lives Matter guy realized, if I talk about some of the good things that the police did, and the fact that they're not all bad, that matters to these people. And maybe I should have done that sooner before this rally. And the same thing on the Trump rallies. If we could just listen to them for a second, and give and not simply make them the result of our assumptions or stereotypes, then maybe we'll be surprised. So I appreciate you guys doing that. I think we're doing that here, and I want to invite more people into this conversation to be able to do that. So I'm going to give you guys the last word, and we'll head out. And I'd love to do this again. I think it's so valuable for folks to do it. I know we've had quite a few followers on this, which has been awesome. But any closing thoughts, Chris? Go ahead.
Yeah, just to answer the question of, who is more of a threat to freedom of belief, freedom of speech, the left or the right. I think culturally, the left kind of has a monopoly on mainstream media, on Hollywood, on social media. I think when you look at it on the government level, the institutional level, the legal level, the right has really been threatening free speech a lot lately. You have Devin Nunes suing all of his critics. You have the president threatening to sue his critics, threatening to shut down a private business for their free expression, threatening a lawsuit against someone for publishing a book that includes criticism of himself. So I think that is just another symbol of our divide right now, where the left kind of runs the culture, the right kind of runs the government.
Yeah.
And that it has been a huge source of resentment from the president and his supporters, because even before Donald Trump was president, he wanted the respect of his peers. He wanted the respect of the culture and the high society that he was born into, and he never quite got it. And I think that's one level where he really connects to his base, is they also feel disrespected by that culture. So yeah, I think the left does in some ways need to be a little bit more tolerant of diversity of opinion. On the other hand, when you have a legal system for the preceding Monday's Supreme Court ruling where people could be fired for their sexual orientation or their gender presentation, I think that is a threat to someone's way of life that kind of dwarfs what we're talking about now. We have cancel culture where people get uh, lose jobs over expressing bad opinions. But thankfully, Monday, for whatever you think of the legal reasoning behind it, people can no longer be discriminated against and fired from a job for who they are.
Yeah.
So I think that's a success. It's a victory for freedom of expression. And hopefully we'll see more victories for free expression on both sides soon.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Kyle. How about you, bud?
Yeah, if I'll kind of piggyback on that, I agree with actually most of what Chris said there. I mean, I think when we see the president and we see Nunez and we see politicians on whatever side trying to silence people for telling their side of the story or their side of the truth, that's obviously very problematic. Yeah. I mean, the left owns cancel culture. We see it every day right now where, you're going to get fired if you wear a wrong T-shirt. If you wear a T-shirt that someone finds offensive, then they're calling for your job. Happened to Mike Gundy, and I don't necessarily agree with One American News Network, whatever. I think they're probably pretty silly, quite honestly. But he has a right to believe that stuff. He has a right to wear that shirt on his own time. He wasn't representing the university. He was wearing it on a fishing trip. Yeah. And one of his players. Again, I think the player was in his rights to do this as well. Will say, I'm not going to play for this guy unless he gives me an apology. I think that's silly and childish, but he has a right to do it. And it's just a shame to see how cancel culture is literally limiting free speech for everybody. I mean, we were talking about what we wanted to talk about tonight, and I sent you guys a message. I was like, listen, I got to be really careful about some of these issues because I work for a company, and if I accidentally say something, even just like outside of what is popular opinion, someone could report me to my company, I'll lose my job. So that's problematic when our culture is like that, when we can't even express differing opinions, not just bad opinions. Chris said you didn't get fired for expressing a bad opinion. You can be fired for expressing a different opinion, bad or not. And that's definitely problematic.
Well, my last thought here, and we'll close out, is it goes back to what Chris is saying, is that if you've got the left owns these institutions and the right owns these, and there's specific people within both movements that are profiting and maintaining that power based upon the cultural war that we are discussing, the only way that we are going to get to a point where we move beyond that is by taking our future into our own hands and saying, enough of the culture war. Let's get back to the basics of what we agree on when it comes to the American ideals of founding the purpose of this country. Let's find that mutual love that we have, even if we express it in different ways, and have conversations like this where we're not tied to either one of those, for our livelihood, and we're not profiting off the cultural war. In fact, we want it to end, or at least to get to a point where we have that camaraderie, which is what we have here on this show. So thank you guys for doing that. Really loved your time. Want to make this a regular thing as often as you are available. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time, guys.
Cool. Thank you, man.